for anyone who doesn't know me, my name is James Goldie. I'm a former PhD student with CLEX. Now I'm part of the knowledge brokerage team with Ian McAdam and now Sana as well. My time is split 50-50. I'm 50% with CLEX. I'm also with the Monash Climate Change Communication Research Hub. It's a small team at Monash Caulfield that does climate change communication. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about storytelling tools for visual abstracts, for blog posts, for press releases. I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about the different sorts of visuals you can make and some of the different ways that they can be used and why you might want to use them. And we're going to go through some of the DIY options because, you know, it's fantastic if you're part of a large project with some funding and you can hire a team to do really sophisticated stuff. But even if you're not, there are really quick things you can do that can add a lot of value to a paper. So I'm going to go through this slide very quickly, but I've done a little bit of weather dynamics in my undergrad, spent a bit of time kicking around doing freelance animation before I did my postgrad. I did my postgrad at UNSW with the CCRC, looking at climate change health impacts. And now I'm part of this knowledge brokerage team and working with the hub as well. So for this talk, I'm going to pause after each section. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Actually, new plan. Don't put them in the chat because I'm looking at PowerPoint and I won't be able to see the chat. So feel free when I do those to just unmute yourself and let me know, and we can have a talk about things. So when I talk about storytelling tools, I'm actually talking about a pretty broad array of things that can range from simple graphics. We talk about the figures in your papers. We talk about the images that you see that you put in your PowerPoint slides, the things that you see in news articles, but it can also mean interviews that you do. It can also mean animations, you know, animated graphics and videos. It can also mean web content, so websites, interactives, things like that. So it's a pretty broad array of things, I think, and it's worth thinking about these categories separately from how these things can appear. For example, graphics that you use might appear in your paper, they might appear on social media, and you might design them differently because of that. Similarly, you might make a video as a visual abstract that's going to sit on your journals page, on your journal papers page, but you might also make something that's designed for stakeholders and it's on a website, or perhaps it's put somewhere else, like in a news article. So, excuse me. So it's worth keeping in mind that people can come together to find your paper in a lot of different ways. And I think it's worth thinking a lot, if you want to make some visuals, taking 5 minutes to think about what kind of visual, not just what kind of visual you want to make, but where you want it to play a role in helping what you want it to do and how you want it to affect people. So for example, a lot of people find journal articles in different ways. They might subscribe to a journal and get email alerts, and then they see your news article, your journal paper there. They might find it through Google Scholar if they're doing a literature review or some other tool. They might hear about it on social media. Maybe you or someone else tweets about your paper and someone sees it. They might read a blog post or news article that references it. They might hear it from a colleague, or you might be having like a lab discussion or a paper review discussion. And so any of those methods might feature visuals. There might be visuals with a tweet, like a graphic or an animation there. Or if you're doing a lab discussion, someone might show a YouTube video they picked up that showed something from it. But if people visit your paper, they might visit it at a journal that allows visual abstracts, which are videos that are attached to your paper's URL. So when they open it up in the journal, there's a YouTube video or something similar there. And that might serve a purpose in helping a researcher understand your paper, or possibly a science journalist. If people grab your paper then and there. They might read it immediately. They might stow it away in a reference manager and then come back to it in 6 months' time. And they might be trying to understand the findings again later. Or they might be scooping it up as part of a larger literature review and come back to it later. Or it might be a stakeholder. It might be someone in business or in government who's trying to quickly understand your paper. Or maybe they think it's useful now and they want to come back to it 6 months, 12 months, 2 years' time because results are changing all the time, or they want a point of comparison. So it's worth thinking if you can have visuals at any step along this journey, your visuals can play a distinct role in helping people go from hearing about your paper to finding your paper, to reading your paper, to citing it, or to acting on the results. And that acting might not be citation, it might be incorporating it into public policy, or it might be changing regulatory environments, things like that. So the first kind of content I'm going to talk about is web content. And even this is a pretty broad category. It can mean full-blown websites that people visit. It can mean a small piece of content that's embedded in a news article and it's interactive. But it's worth talking about some of the big differences you see in these sorts of content. For example, you might want something that's going to drive interest in your paper. For example, here's a small map that I produced for a paper a couple of years ago that Sarah Perkins Kirkpatrick produced on heat waves. This is, although it's full screen at the moment, this is an embeddable map. So this took a couple of hours to be produced. The main thinking behind it was that we want something that's going to be picked up by journalists to get a lot of news coverage for this paper. And so this was something that was designed to be pretty at a glance. There's not much to it. You can see the map is shaded by the number of additional heatwave days per year. And up in the top right, you've got some radio buttons for different levels of global mean warming. And so this is designed to be something that somebody might interact with for 30 seconds, maybe a minute. They're probably not going to come back to it, but it's going to be picked up by many people. And so this was embedded when we released the paper, or when the paper was released, I should say. It's not my paper. We put it in, we embedded it with the press release that Alvin put out, and we put the code for journalists to use this in their own news coverage, the same way you would with a YouTube video. And so this was picked up by SMH, by Cosmos magazine, and it got about 100,000 views over the course of a month or so. Most of that was in the week that it was released. In fact, the 24 to 48 hours after the paper's release, when the news coverage hit, and then there was a secondary spike when Cosmos picked it up about a month later. But sometimes you will see, if this stuff is accessible, you might see one news outlet pick it up, and then that causes another news outlet to pick it up, and so on. So making this stuff easily accessible can be really useful. But on the flip side, you might have something that is designed to be an ongoing resource, something that stakeholders or the public return to, or maybe other researchers return to it. Maybe this is less of a something to drive interest to a paper and more of a tool. For example, this is Scorcher, Sarah's website here. And this is something that people can return to because it has ongoing live data. It's picking up observations from the Bureau. It's making heatwave calculations, and then people can go back to it anytime to see where in Australia there's a heatwave at the moment, and why it's been a heatwave recently in a certain area. And so other examples of this, my own website Is It Hot Right Now is another example, but many people have websites like this that are designed for people to come back to them. And it's not necessarily important that this be able to handle 100,000 people at once. So I'm not, with a tool like this, we might be concerned that it can handle a few people simultaneously, maybe even dozens if it's popular, if something on social media is driving interest to it. But I don't need this to be able to handle 10,000 people at the same time. But the prerequisites with these kinds of websites are that there either has to be live data that people return to. There needs to be either that, or there needs to be periodic updates to the information available, or you need like a bank of reference knowledge here. This might be an educational site with, say, like lesson plans or a bank of articles or something, something that somebody's going to return to when they want to refer back to knowledge on a certain area. So many of these kinds of web content can be produced very quickly by a more skilled person. For example, something like the heatwave video, as I said, that took me about 2 to 3 hours to put together. But if you're not experienced with the software that's used to create it, it might be difficult for you to put together. So it's worth, with these sorts of things, to reach out to someone like me who can advise you on whether something like this is feasible to do really quickly. And if it's not, to suggest other options that might make it really feasible to do quickly, especially if you've got a paper coming up soon, because it can vary quite a lot in terms of the requirements. Another option, if you feel like trying something like this yourself, the CMS team has done previous training videos that are really helpful. For example, Danny has done one building web apps with R and Shiny. So if you've written R code before, or maybe even if you've written Python but not R, you can put something together really quickly. You might be able to put something together that people can refer to in the future. And there are other visualization videos up there as well. Martin's done one on 3D visualization, and there are other ones available on like plotting with Python. So you can get a lot of great tips there. But again, it's worth, if you're going down this road, thinking first about how do you want people to engage with this? When do you see them interacting with it compared to your paper? And what's the end result that you're looking for here? If this is an area where you're not super skilled, there are lots of other tools that you can use to quickly do something yourself. One of my favorite institutions is the Night Lab. They have a whole bunch of different tools that you can use in the browser to quickly throw some interactive content together. So for example, here's their timeline tool that lets you build an interactive timeline. So this is one on the history of women in computing. And you can see there's like feature panels here with content, like text, images, and then there's a timeline running down the bottom. And people can scroll through this. And this is something that could be embedded in a news article really easily. And you pretty much put it together with a Google spreadsheet. They give you a template, you fill out the spreadsheet, and you follow their instructions, and it gives you one of those codes that you can use to embed it. Here's another one of their tools, their storyline one, which is for annotating time series. So you can give them some time series data, and you can specify where you want people to be able to click to see what's happened. And here's one of their more sophisticated ones called Story Map. And the idea with Story Map is that it's for things like, you imagine like a field trip where you might go from one place to another place to another place, different points in space, and these are attached to different bits of content, so like explanations. We did this here, then we did this here, and then we went here and did this. So all of these tools are available on Night Lab for anyone to use. They're designed for journalists, but they can be used by scientists as well if you want to publicize your work. They're a great way, not just to talk about your paper, but maybe to talk about the field work that you did to get that paper. And maybe that's part of building the story that engages people with your work. It wasn't just that we figured out this thing about Antarctica or country Victoria or wherever it is that we went. It was also about how we got there, how the trip went, and how we worked these things out as we went along. So those sorts of tools are really great for time series data or for paths through space. And I looked at some of these tools when we did. I worked on the ArcSys showcase a couple of years ago, but I found there weren't as many tools available for the sorts of gridded data sets we often use as climate scientists. And so one thing I developed for that showcase was a tool called Explore ClinDex. And there were two ideas with this. So ClinDex is a set of climate extremes indices that we've pre-calculated for observational data sets. So you can find out, for example, at the moment on Explore ClinDex, I'm looking at warm nights index, the fraction of warm nights index, TN90P. And so this is showing the fraction of each year that is above the 90th percentile. And so this is done with, this is calculated on HADX2, a gridded observational data set. And on Explore ClinDex, you can step through each year of this index, of this net CDF. You can also see the annual trend and the annual average. And so you can go on this site and you can check out any of these layers. But we also wanted something that would take people through in a more curated fashion, because ClinDex has hundreds of different layers. There's probably like 600 or 700 net CDFs in this tool, and there's just way too many for someone to look at. So we wanted to pull out some of the interesting areas. And so I developed a story mode for the Explore ClinDex, where we can program different stories. And so those look a bit more like this. So the idea with this was, have these curated steps through some of the interesting parts of the data. The entirety of Explore ClinDex probably took about 3 months for me to put together at mostly full time. So this was a large project, but the technology developed to deliver the stories is also something that could be made a little bit more portable. And so I'm thinking a little bit about ways that this could be generalized and used by other people in the future. For example, there's no reason why one of these stories couldn't be embedded in a news article the way Night Lab or other maps are. There are some options for how this could go forward. I could possibly just duplicate it with someone's net CDFs on their request once or twice off. And that would be probably like a less ambitious option. A much more ambitious option would be to develop a service where you could upload your own net CDF and write one of these stories yourself in a browser, the way you could with, say, Night Lab or something. And so I'm considering some of the options for this. And if anyone has any questions about this stuff or ideas for what they would like Explore ClinDex to be in the future, or for other options or tools, I'd love to hear them now. So if you want to ask a question now, we'll just pause for a quick second.
James, Ian McAdam here. I'm wondering if it's possible actually to put a voiceover over some of these stories and perhaps a little, you could record a YouTube clip or something of the scientist talking to camera to go with that, to put a bit more of a human touch to it.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the nice things about web content is that you can turn it into a video really easily by recording it as you're interacting with it. Macs and Windows both have inbuilt ways of recording the screen, so do iPads. On a Mac, you could use the QuickTime Player until recently, but I think the new version of macOS has a different keyboard shortcut for doing it. On Windows, you can use the Windows Game Bar, which is designed for video games, but can be used with anything. You can just say, yeah, my browser is a game, or my copy of PowerPoint is a game. And PowerPoint itself can also export video as well. So for example, in Windows, I would hit Windows G to bring up the game bar and I'd click record, and then I'd start playing around with something, and it'll pick up the mic as well if you tell it to. So you can just narrate as you click around some web content, and then that'll save it as a video and you can throw that on YouTube. So that's definitely a good way to take existing web content, add voiceovers. I definitely think that some of the tools, I don't know about Night Lab ones, but I think it would be fantastic if a tool like Explore ClinDex or one of these Night Lab ones could also feature narration.
Thanks, James.
No worries. Any other questions? Okay, I'll go on to animations next. I think the particular strength of animations is to illustrate complex processes. And as climate scientists, we deal with a lot of complex processes and mechanisms. So this example is from the Bureau of Meteorology. This is one of the videos that they've produced with Agatha doing voiceover. And it kind of moves between animations and explanations and stock footage. But I think this animation is really powerful.
During the neutral phase, steady trade winds blow across the tropical Pacific from the east to west. These winds pile up warm water in the western Pacific. In contrast, water temperatures to the east are lower as the trade winds cause cool water to be drawn up from the deep. The temperature difference across the tropical Pacific Ocean causes air to rise to Australia's north and descend near South America. This creates a huge connected cycle called the Walker circulation.
So this is a really sophisticated animation. You have a map there that's changing projection over time. You have a whole bunch of annotations on it, and some of those annotations are staying with the projection as it moves. You've then got like a sub panel down the bottom, and then you have other things happening in 3D. So I would imagine that this is probably something, you know, the Bureau has more of has been doing a lot more visual content in the last couple of years. I imagine they have a dedicated graphics team, or at least on-call contractors who can do this sorts of things. So it's probably a few people working together to produce something, you know, within days. But a single person doing this, it would probably take quite a bit of time. This is a slightly more modest one that I produced for one of Stephen Sherwood's papers back in 2015. The idea was to talk about how different climate models represent circulation processes in the lower and upper atmosphere and the implications of that for climate sensitivity. So this took me about, I'd say about 25 hours to do the two shots. This is one of those two shots.
The previous estimates of climate sensitivity were that it would be somewhere between 1.5 degrees and 4 or 5 degrees for a doubling of the atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration, which is something that we think will happen by middle of this century. What we found is that it really has to be above 3 degrees. Anything below that is not consistent with the observations.
So this is what I would probably call bespoke content. This is stuff that is fairly manual labor intensive by a skilled person, takes quite a bit of time. If you want to produce this stuff, if you have a process that you feel is really complicated and difficult to convey to people quickly, this can be a really good way to do it, but it often requires quite a bit of time or money. If that is something you do want to explore, I can help you find contractors or freelancers who engage in that sort of thing, and they can advise you a little bit more about requirements and can help you figure out like time requirements, budget, that sort of thing. But yeah, as I've mentioned, this can take quite a bit of time, and it's going to depend quite a lot on the complexity, which can scale quite a bit. You could have quite a simple animation, or you could have a really complex one. And so, you know, animation is something that can burn as much money as you have, really. But not everyone has that option, especially if you're a student, but often many researchers don't have the budget for this sort of thing. So let's talk about some much quicker options. The easiest way to do things is to draw with an iPad or a tablet and record yourself doing it. I mentioned that Windows and Macs both have screen recording. iPads have this as well. It's built right in. You just pull down from the control center and hit record, and then start doing stuff on your iPad. This is a static example produced by a journalist named Kate Doyle at the ABC. If you've ever read Kate's articles on ABC Online, you often see these images embedded in the news articles. She's using what I believe is an app called OneNote, which comes with Microsoft Office. But you know, it's doing a lot of things like sketching over projections of the globe and then overlaying climate processes. And this can be a really quick way to put something together quickly on your own that can help illustrate a process. And you might be thinking that this is something that I wouldn't put in a journal article, and that's absolutely fine. But the rules are a bit different when you're looking at other types of content, like, you know, social media for example, we'll talk about towards the end, and the rules are really different there. And even something like this is put up on the ABC, which means you should really think about if you have a bit of time. Maybe you don't consider yourself an artist. I certainly don't. I don't have any like life drawing or natural drawing experience, but you can always trace over things like maps and then add overlays. And then actually OneNote in particular is really great because after you've drawn everything, you can actually use a time slider to have it replay on screen, going from nothing to being drawn up. And so you can add elements over time. So that's if you're screen recording as that goes, that's a really fantastic way to put an animation together quickly. One of the other options is to use PowerPoint. PowerPoint has actually quite sophisticated animation tools. If you've ever seen one of my talks, I love to abuse them. But they can do, I think when used tastefully, they can help unpack complexity really well. So for example, these next two slides are actually from one of a sort of Climate 101 talks that I give to journalism students. And this is all happening natively in PowerPoint. Newer versions of PowerPoint can do things like 3D models. They can do fairly complex animations. And they can unpack processes over time. The key thing to keep in mind, of course, with PowerPoint presentations is if you're planning to give a talk at a conference or another venue, in a hypothetical reality where we're not all locked in at home, often the new version of PowerPoint isn't installed. It's sometimes difficult to predict what you're going to get when you get to the venue. And so it's worth having some backup options. But in cases where you do get to control the laptop that you're delivering on, like if you're doing a Zoom from home, and that you've got a fairly modern version of PowerPoint, these sorts of content can be really helpful for making it a bit easier to step through a complex figure. So when you're putting a figure together like this, I like to take a complex figure and just start with small parts of it. For example, faceted or multi-panel plots can be a really good target for these. You might even have a journal paper that has a figure that's like 16 panels or 9 panels or something. And maybe that's too much at once, but you can hide all but one panel. You can just draw a couple of white rectangles over most of it, start with one panel, establish the rules for your plot. What's the x-axis? What's the y-axis? How are things colored? What do the shapes mean? What's the key takeaway from this panel? Then open up some of the other panels and say, when we now look at this case in 9 other cases, we can see these differences. That's a much better way to introduce people to the rules of how this complexity works than just throwing up 9 panels at once and going, just look at the first panel. And so these sorts of animations can be used in heaps of places. As I said, you can use them in your PowerPoint presentations if you're giving a talk at a conference. You can also export from PowerPoint to video, and that means you can use that for your social media content, or it can be the basis of your social media content before you start working on it. It can also be your visual abstract because you can narrate over things in PowerPoint. You can literally make a visual abstract just out of PowerPoint content if you absolutely have to. So in that case, you don't really need any new assets at all. You just got to be willing to step through figures slowly if you're going to present them, maybe cut in some other stock images or while you talk, or if you're feeling really brave, you can interview yourself or have a friend interview you, and you can cut that in as well. So if anyone has any questions about animations, I'd love to answer them. If not, we'll move on to social media content as one of the last things. One of the really great things about social media content is that once you produce it, it can often be reused quite a lot. Like DIY animations, social content that you produce for one social media channel can be used on another, or it can be used as slides. And that's really, really, really powerful, I think, especially if, as I said, when you're producing a paper, once that paper's been accepted, you kind of have that panic of, here are 12 things I need to do. often you can kind of get away with ticking a lot of these boxes with just one piece of content, one or two pieces. So the basis of your social media content could be a slide from your presentation or a figure from your paper, could be an interview, it could be a sketch that you've done on your iPad. But the thing you might want to do is you might want to start overlaying it. So that might be taking some of the things I just talked about with animations, so building it up with shapes to hide parts of a figure. It could also be adding key messages from your paper. So if you've ever done media training with Alvin, he often talks about figuring out what are your 3 basic messages. And so that might be answering questions like, what's the problem? What did we do in this study? Why are these results important? Where I can go for more information, whether that's your paper, or maybe if this is for the public and it's social media, maybe you want to intersperse a blog post before people get to the paper so that they can understand it in a more plain English way. And you can use the answers to these questions. If you can answer them in just a few words, like a tweet, then you can pop that on top of a visual. And I think one of the most powerful tools for this is actually Instagram stories. You don't need to be someone who posts on Instagram to take advantage of this, although you absolutely can be. The thing about Instagram stories is that under the hood, it's actually sneakily a really great, quick photo and video editor. And you can download the photos and videos that you get from Instagram stories, and you can use them in other places like Twitter or your slides for a conference. And because like a lot of social media, it's much more relaxed than a journal paper, means you can also break a lot of the rules for when it comes to producing content. You don't need to worry quite as much about white space when you're making one of these, as long as any text is pretty clearly legible and you're not going too overboard with the word count, you can produce these things really quickly. And to prove it to you, I'm going to show you one that I threw together in literally 2 minutes. This is me taking a screenshot from Is It Hot Right Now? I've thrown it into the Instagram Stories editor, and now I'm just adding some text and a little animated thermometer. So all you need here is the 1 or 2 bits of text you want to put on here. You can search for animated images in the editor. You just start with your base content, you throw something on, and then you position it over the top. It's going to be done really, really, really quickly. I will say this is being conservative, because half of these 2 minutes are me misspelling things and then backspacing. This is, our URL, but it could just as easily be a link to your paper or a link to the press release or the blog post that you wrote on, Medium or your WordPress or your personal site. And obviously the screenshot is static, but if you add an animated thing that you find on the editor, you can export a video, and that might be something that grabs a bit more attention if you use this as a tweet or something with your blog post. So that's done in 1 minute and 54 seconds. And once it's saved, you can download it to your phone, and then you can share it to any other app. You can share it to Twitter, to Facebook for your friends and family to help them understand it. It can be used by a journalist to be embedded in a news article. So I think this is a really powerful way to quickly produce something that is visually engaging, and you don't need to have a whole bunch of content already prepared. So that's the final product. Like, there's not much happening here. There's just the animated thermometer for a little bit of motion, a couple of key messages and a link. Tells people they can go back to they can go onto the site to have a look at what's happening today anytime. And the nice thing is, if you're still not feeling comfortable downloading Instagram and trying this out, the CLEX Instagram team is really active. They can help you. They can give you advice for making these things if you need help with it. But they can also put it on the CLEX Instagram account, which is quite active. So anytime you've got a new paper and you want to get it out there, you can absolutely put it on there. Instagram has a bit of a different audience than Twitter, but I think a lot of people really engage with stuff on Instagram as well. So it's worth considering. And if you don't want to, you can just you can use it as a photo video editor, take that content and you can throw it somewhere else. In summary, and if anyone has any questions about social media stuff, I'm happy to answer that in a sec as well. But I'll just summarize quickly. So visuals can play a bunch of different roles in helping you. As a researcher, they can help people find and understand your papers, which might lead to citations. It can also help people return to papers later when they're coming back and trying to understand it again 6 months later. It can also help people act on the findings of your paper. If your paper has policy implications for government or for business to understand their risk, or for people to understand their behavior and how they might need to change it, which for me as a health researcher is really important, then visuals can help them digest that really quickly. There are lots of people who can help you build sophisticated visuals. It is worth keeping in mind that sometimes this can take a lot of time or money, and it's worth talking to people well ahead of time to understand how that complexity will affect the budget in terms of time or money. But certainly the knowledge brokerage team, CMS team, can help you understand these options. For people who are short on time or money, or both, there are definitely DIY options. We talked about some of those today. It might be sketching something on an iPad. It might be using Instagram stories to put together a video really, really quickly. It might be using online tools like the Night Lab to produce an interactive that helps get your story across. So yeah, knowledge brokerage team and CMS team have a bit of experience with some of these forms of visual storytelling. So feel free to reach out to us and ask. If you want to look at some of the CMS team's other videos for building some of this yourself, please go through that. I'm always happy to answer questions about if you want to build a website, if you want to build an interactive, if you have an idea for an animation and you're not sure how it would work, feel free to reach out. So if anyone has any other questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
I have two. The Instagram story editor only works on the phone, or is there like a desktop version like WhatsApp?
There isn't. I'm actually not 100% sure there. I know that Instagram is available in the web browser. Don't know if there's a stories editor in it though. I think you can view stories, not so sure about editing.
You can't edit stories in on the web or anything, but you can make them in like PowerPoint or something in the dimensions of a phone screen and then put them on your phone and upload them.
Thanks, Bethany. Yeah, that sounds like a good option.
But so then you would be doing the animation on PowerPoint.
Either way could work, I think. You could try animating in PowerPoint and sending that out to your phone and then add stuff on there, or you could take something static from PowerPoint and then size that and send that and then add an animation in Instagram. I would say if you're trying to use animation to illustrate a process, you're probably better off trying to do that in PowerPoint, where the tools are probably a bit more sophisticated. If you're looking for something to add a little bit of flash to a static graphic, I'd say Instagram's probably going to be a bit easier. So it probably depends on what you want.
Yeah, thanks. And my second question is, well, maybe it's a bit of a tangent line, but so how do you get the journalists, like general journalists, interest in your stories? Are you like, do you write to them, or you just hope that they will see it, or how does that work?
I would say the best person to do this for you is going to be Alvin. Or if you're working with another organization, if they have a comms officer, that person is going to be the person to speak to. Comms officers, we do a little bit of this at the Hub as well. We already have established relationships with journalists and can reach out to them. A lot of them might use newswire services. Often if something hits, if something is picked up by a journalist for, say, Reuters or AAP, a lot of other smaller outlets will rely on those reports to find stuff. You can send press releases straight to journalists. I would strongly recommend going through Alvin because he can help you tweak the message, figure out what's going to work, and help you find journalists as well to help. And he can tell you this journalist often works on these kinds of stories or has this particular expertise or background, whereas this journalist has a different background. This one might be one to avoid altogether. So yeah, my number one advice there is speak to Alvin. Speak to him early if you can, because he always appreciates more lead time. All of these sorts of things, benefit from more lead time. But there are always options, even if you don't have a lot of lead time. So yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot.
No worries.
Hi James, Ian McAdam here again. I really loved your 2-minute demo of use of the Instagram stories. You mentioned the CLEX Instagram team. Is it best to contact Alvin to get through to them?
Sorry, could you say that again?
You mentioned the CLEX Instagram team could help with Instagram posts and Instagram stories. Is Alvin the best contact for them?
Probably. I think there are people at a variety of CLEX nodes. So if you know someone on the team at your node, I'd say speak to them, but otherwise Alvin can help you get in touch with them. Okay, well, thanks very much for listening, everyone. I hope there's some helpful stuff for you in there. If you have any questions, again, don't hesitate to get in touch. My email is james.goldie@monash.edu. And you can always email either me or Ian. I know the CMS team would love to hear from you if you have questions about putting together web or interactive stuff as well. But yeah, thanks very much. Hopefully see you all soon.